Hello and welcome to the channel. Today what we're going to talk about is deleting a row from a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet using the new Power Automate desktop. Let's go. Now let's talk a little bit about why this episode is important. So deleting a row inside of an Excel spreadsheet isn't as straightforward as one might think. In part due to the need to be able to determine what row you want to delete first based upon some sort of criteria. So you generally want to search or find a specific row based upon some sort of data characteristic and then go ahead and delete that row. So for example, an invoice number. So once we've gone ahead and located that data that we want to delete, we subsequently need to know the row number so that we can pass it into the delete row action that's found inside of Power Automate desktop. Now, there are some limits in terms of what are our options to solve this problem. Like another one that I was thinking about was trying to use like the Excel find feature where we could try and find that specific invoice number, but then it just leads to other challenges. So for example, what happens if you don't find it? Then you need to start compensating that and have to get into more UI automation where you're trying to basically use computer vision to look at the dialog to see that there was no entries found. What if there's more than one entry found? And it just felt like it was going to get messy. So I'm going to suggest more of a brute force method that's going to require looping, where we can find our invoice based upon an invoice number column and subsequently get the row number that we can go ahead and delete. So this might take a little bit longer than the other method that I did describe, but I feel like it'll become a more reliable solution for us to go ahead and use. Before we dive deeper into the content, I wanted to let you know about an emerging community found at serverlessnotes.com. This is a community resource that covers best practices, tips, and latest announcements built on contributions by technology enthusiasts from around the globe. On serverlessnotes.com, you'll find content related to Power Automate, Azure Logic Apps, Azure Service Bus, Azure Functions, and much, much more. Serverlessnotes.com is brought to you by Serverless 360, a portal that is focused on operations and support for Microsoft Azure serverless resources. Now, this is a complementary tool to the Azure portal, and it helps organizations in supporting Azure serverless applications. You can find out more about Serverless 360. Okay, so let's go ahead. Let's just get right into the demo. I think that's the best way to proceed in this video. Okay, so here I am. I'm in Excel and I have a spreadsheet that I want to use for my example. It's pretty simple. I've got 4 columns. Note, I do not need a data table like I would if I was using the Power Automate Cloud Flows connector for Microsoft Excel. Also note that this is going to be stored locally on my machine as well. It's not in OneDrive or SharePoint. But in this case, what I do want to do is I want to be able to delete this specific row, the row that contains this invoice number, and I want just to be able to delete this row. And I've put it right in the middle just on purpose to illustrate this point that we have to actually go ahead and find that record first, and then we'll go ahead and we will delete it. And now I am over in Power Automate Desktop, and I have created a script that we can use to go ahead and locate any rows that have this value and then naturally go ahead and delete them. So what I've done to start off with, if I've created 2 variables. So I've gone ahead and used the set variable action, which we can find on the left-hand side, and then I've declared 2 variables. Here I've declared delete value. And so this really represents the invoice number that I want to delete. And I've set the value to this here. Naturally, if I was going to call this from Power Automate, the service itself, I could go ahead and declare an input. For this video, we're just going to use local debugging, so I'm using a variable here instead. The other thing I've gone ahead and done is I've created a variable called row counter. And this is what I'm going to use as I'm iterating through the different rows to keep track of what row number I'm on, so that when I go ahead and pass in a value to the delete command, that I have the row that I'm actually interested in deleting. As a reminder, the row that we're interested in is this one that has this ID, invoice ID. It happens to be row 4. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to launch Excel. So that's one of the actions that are available. If we just type in Excel here on the left-hand side, we're going to find the launch Excel action. We just need to configure a step or two here. We need to provide the document path, and we want to ensure that we are launching Excel with the following document itself. And that's essentially all we need to do on this step. Now what we're going to do next is we're going to get the first free row on a column from an Excel worksheet. So the reason we're doing this is that we want to loop through the entire spreadsheet, but we only want to loop through the rows where we have data. So what that action will do is it'll detect that row 8 is the first row that is free. And what this allows us to do is just create some logic here to say I only want to go ahead and loop through the rows up until row 7 because I know anything beyond that is going to be blank. So we don't want to waste processing cycles going through all of those empty rows. So that is the purpose of this specific action. Now what we're going to do is we're going to provide a column that we want to inspect to detect if it's actually free because there's no text. And so column A is our leftmost column. And then do note that this is going to create a variable. This is the default name, first free row on column. And so in this case, this is going to return 8 for us, and that will allow us to stop at that location. So what we'll do now is we are going to go ahead and use the read from Excel worksheet. And what we're going to do is we want to select this drop down and we want to choose values from a range of cells. And then what we're going to do is we're going to provide basically a starting point and an end point. And so what this is going to do is start in the first row that has column A, and we're going to end on column D, and then our first free row on column -1. So here is column D, and then what we're saying is we want to end on this row and then -1, which means here. And so essentially what we're going to do is focus on these rows that are contained here. And I'm going to talk about our header here right now. So when we expand this advanced drop down here, we're going to say first line of range contains column names, or our headers. So that's important to turn on so that we won't start on that first row. We're actually going to start on the second row. So that's really important. Now do note that this is once again going to provide produce an output, and it's going to be called Excel data. So now what we're going to do is we're going to add a loop. So if we go ahead over here and type in loop, we will see our for loop, right? So we can go ahead and drag this loop out and over here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to configure it. So we want to iterate over top of our Excel data, basically our list of rows. And what's going to happen is a variable will be produced called a current item. And you can think of this essentially as our row of data. It's going to include all of those 4 columns, and we can now essentially iterate through it. It's kind of like a data row, and that's exactly what we're going to do. So in order to move our index along, we're going to increase our variable. So this is our row counter, and we're going to increase it from 1 to 2 because we're going to be on row 2 when we start. And then what we're going to do is just a comparison. We're going to compare if the current item, so our current row, we can access the invoice column by its name, or we can use essentially a number to represent the column itself, which happens to be 0 based. So just be aware of that. I'm going to be more explicit here and provide the name of the column, which happens to be invoice. I'm going to see if it is equal to our delete value. If you recall, our delete value is 1, then 5 zeros, and then 3. And so if it is that specific row, we're going to go ahead and drag the delete row from Excel worksheet action into our condition here, and we're going to pass in our Excel instance, which was created up here when we launched Excel, and we're going to pass in the row to delete, which happens to be our row counter. So that's why that variable is important, because it'll go ahead and it'll say, in this case, row 4, go ahead and delete that specific row. We're going to end our condition and end our loop. And then what we'll go ahead and do is we will close our Excel document and we will save it. So I'm going to make sure my Excel document is closed here, and we will go ahead and run this and then check out to make sure that our Excel document was successfully updated. Let's go ahead, let's click run. So now we see that it's running. We're going through each loop. We detected our invoice, and now we're going to close and save our file. So let's go ahead, let's open up Excel. Okay, sure enough, our record 1, then 5 zeros 3 has been removed, and what used to be in row 5 is now moved up and is in row 4. So this worked successfully. So just to do a little bit of a recap, what we did talk about today is how we can, number one, open up an Excel document, how we can read from Excel by selecting a range. Then what we've been able to do is iterate over top of that row collection, and then just be able to go ahead and do a comparison. When we find the record that we want, we can go ahead and we can delete the row. Now, you could use a similar approach if you needed to say insert a row right after another one. This approach would also work. And it is a little bit of brute force, but I feel like it's going to be more reliable than trying to use UI automation and trying to use computer vision to detect different dialog boxes and all of that stuff. I feel like that's should be a last resort. So hopefully this is useful to you, and thanks for checking out this video. All right, so that concludes another episode for this year. Actually, I'm recording this on December 31st. So thanks everyone for checking out my channel over the course of this year. Look for more next year in 2021. If you're not following me on Twitter, I encourage you to do so. You can find me at Weare. On top of that, obviously you're on YouTube, and I appreciate that. But anything you can do from a likes and subscribes, that would be awesome. So thanks. Have a happy and safe New Year's, and we'll catch you next year. Bye.